from a young age. Got it. Okay. From a young age, I have enjoyed being outside and being around plants. And I never really thought more about why I enjoyed it until someone introduced me to the program called Nature RX at Cornell. And I'm going to talk about that program in a little while, but I wanted just to sort of introduce it by saying that that program is an offshoot of, oops, here we go. That program is an offshoot of Parks RX America. And this was started several years ago by Dr. Robert Czar, who was a physician in the Washington, D.C. area, who had worked in communities of a lot of immigrant communities and low-income communities. And he was really interested in developing ways that his patients might see positive outcomes, much more positive outcomes than they were that were inexpensive, among other things. And as you can see here, he's the way he did that was to begin prescribing visits to parks to, as he says, to prevent and treat chronic disease, promote well-being, and rekindle a connection between people and the outdoor world. And since that time, that movement and the concept of writing formal prescriptions for patients to spend time in nature has sort of taken off. And even if you didn't know about, this program, it's become more and more obvious if you pay attention to the sort of popular media. I mean, there's been an explosion since COVID of articles that feature stories that are basically journalists report of one study or another talking about how being in nature is good for us, that we feel better when we spend time in nature. And so what I would like to do in this talk is just tell you about what I've learned in my own readings about the sort of a little bit about the science behind some of these studies, and then also delve a little bit into why nature works, if you will. If you're more interested, or if you're interested in a deeper dive, I recommend The Nature Fix by Florence Williams. This is an incredibly accessible and fun book to read, and she traces sort of the history of the history of the use of nature for mental health benefits and health in general, but mostly mental health, I think she's focusing on. And then the other book is Nature and Psychology. It's an edited review, part of a series, and it just came out this summer. And that's for people interested in a much deeper dive into the psychology. So as far as I can tell, there are basically three different sort of categories of studies that people have used to study nature. And one of them, the first one here, is this controlled laboratory study. And it's basically exactly what it sounds like, that people are given images or objects in the lab, and then the effect of those objects or images is studied. And one of the very first, and probably one of the more important studies in this arena was actually conducted by Roger Ulrich in 1984. And some of you may remember this one. It got a lot of attention in the media. Basically what he did, he was in a suburban hospital in Pennsylvania, one hospital, and he and his team went back through 6 years of records looking for patients that had one particular type of gallbladder surgery. And they found something like 46 patients that fit that criteria. And then they divided them into two groups, and they paired them for age and sex, and to some extent, as much as they could, what floor they were on when they had the surgery, what their doctors were, socioeconomic factors. I mean, they couldn't control for everything, but what they were interested in is whether or not there was an effect of looking through a window at a green view, that is the trees and the grass that were outside the hospital, versus looking through a window that looked onto the L of the building, which was a brick wall. And what they found was that there was significantly shorter recovery time, and that people asked for less pain medication when they were in rooms that had windows that looked out on green space. And since that time, there has been an explosion, literally an explosion of these kinds of studies. And they tend to be, they either use objects that represent nature, like potted plants or flowers or wooden material, but generally they're in the room, so it's still a visual effect, or they use images of nature, like three-dimensional images and even up to virtual reality. And then there's also studies that focus on sounds of nature, but I'm not going to go into those. But the bottom line is that most of these studies show that just being around and seeing nature makes a difference. And in fact, it's probably seeing green that makes a big difference, because there was a study that came out, and then there's a whole field of color psychology, and people who study color psychology will tell you that green makes people feel calm and restored. But there was a study done by Ackers in 2012 where he had participants on stationary bicycles. This was an exercise physiology study, and he showed them one of these three images that you see here at the top of the screen. He showed them this image of trees in a road that was natural colors versus monochromatic versus red filtered images. And then he looked at how people assessed their mood and how hard they felt like they had to work during the exercise. And so the exertion perception. And in all cases, there was less of a perception of exertion and a greater sense of elevated mood in the participants who rode the bike in front of the green image. So even just images are important. And there was this study not too long ago that was a review of a particular group of these images, and the people who did this sort of a meta-analysis were looking for studies that, and that's the study on the bottom here, they were looking for studies that specifically focused on some measure of sort of relaxation, how people felt, and then they were also pairing those with physiological measures. So they were looking either at things like salivary cortisol levels as an indication of the presence of stress hormones, or various other biological markers like heart rate and blood pressure. Or they were even, in some cases, had done sort of brain scans and were looking for the effects of nature. And what they found was that when people just viewed nature, they felt more relaxed and showed a greater stabilization of prefrontal cortex activity and the autonomic nerve activity. And then when real nature stimuli were present, they actually showed positive effects on autonomic nervous activity and cerebral effects as well. So this was really, sort of, I think, this was a review of some 50 studies, and most of them, not all, but most of them are showing that even just images of nature matters. The second type of study that's often done are what are called cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. And these both involve generally much larger numbers of participants, and they tend to focus on proximity to nature as the measure of engagement with nature. And so one of them, like, for example, this happiness study here was done in the UK there was a couple of papers that came out about this, but over the last, say, 10 years or so. And what they found, as you can see, is that happiness is greater in natural environments. But the way they did the study, I thought was really interesting. They had over 20,000 participants, and they had people you had to have a cell phone. And so basically what they would do is ping people randomly throughout the day. And when they got the ping, they had agreed to answer a short questionnaire on how they were feeling. They had to provide a brief description in terms of where they were, what they were doing. And then because they were on cell phones, the researchers could use the GPS information to actually determine their proximity to nature from a completely different, sort of more objective perspective. And across the board, what the authors conclude is that people are significantly and substantially happier outdoors in all green or natural habitat types than when they are in urban environments. And so this comparison between sort of natural environments and urban environments is characteristic of these long studies, of the sort of types of larger studies. People have also done things like various educational outcomes in schools that are either surrounded by green space or not, all kinds of studies like this. But these studies are correlational, right? We don't really know based on these studies if it's just the proximity to green space that's causing this increase in or positive change in whatever factor it is we're looking at. And then the final type is, the third type of study are these experimental field studies. And these studies tend to focus on fewer numbers of people, generally 20 to 40 participants in a study. And they look at either within group or between group changes in psychological and cognitive dimensions, dimensions sort of before and after nature exposure or natural versus urban environments. And for example, this is characteristic of these types of studies. This was based on about 20 to 40 people. And basically all of these individuals had, well, this particular study was based on 20 people, and all of the people had been diagnosed with major depressive disorder. And the researchers were interested in the effects of spending time in nature on short-term memory and on mood. And so they used standard psychological assessments for both mood and short-term memory. And the way that they did the study was that they had people come in, they took these tests, and then they were asked to undergo a period of rumination, which is basically 50 minutes of sitting there thinking about sort of autobiographical things that leave you feeling negative and sad. And then they asked people to go for a walk in either an urban or a natural environment, and then they retook the test. And then the following week, they brought the same groups in, but they had them go to the opposite environments. And what this showed was that when people spent time in nature, they had increases in mood and also increases in short-term memory. Probably one of the most important of these kinds of studies, I think, was done by Greg Bratman in 2015. And this was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. And basically, this team started out with a specific hypothesis, which was that that nature might have the specific effect of reducing rumination, or this sort of negative self-referential thought. And that if it did, they might also expect to see a change in the activity of this subgenual prefrontal cortex region of the brain, because previous studies had shown increases in activity when people in this region of the brain, when people were really sad or ruminating. And so what they did was when people arrived at the study or for the study, they had them fill out this psychological profile questionnaire, which was called the RRQ, the Reflection Rumination Questionnaire. And then each of the participants underwent a scan that looked at the amount of cerebral blood flow in particular regions of the brain, in particular this subgenual prefrontal cortex region. And then they sent them out in, they split them into two groups, and they sent one group into a nature area and the other group to an urban area. This study was done at Stanford. So basically they either walked in the woods around Stanford or they walked downtown Palo Alto, and then for 90 minutes, and then they came back and underwent the same set of tests. They all took the questionnaire again, and they all also had the scans done. And the results are shown here in the green bars over here on what is my left. You can see that their levels of rumination dropped significantly for the group that was in nature relative to the group that was in the urban environment. And at the same time, the activity in the subgenual prefrontal cortex region also declined, which, this is the region where the activity goes up generally with rumination. So this declined significantly. And so presumably because these two areas had been linked before, the effect that we're seeing on nature on behavior, on rumination, is actually directly related to the effect that nature has on the brain. Or at least that was the idea. They're pretty closely related. And so Bratman and his group in another paper, he's a pretty active researcher in this area, and he's sort of finally willing to say that there's a mounting body of evidence from experimental studies that nature exposure actually plays a causal, not just a correlative, but a causal role in improving affect, which is basically your mood in the short term. And in this same review, and the reference is down here, it's actually a paper on ecosystem, nature and mental health, and the potential for nature to provide ecosystem services through its effect on mental health. We could talk about that later if you want to, but in this review, he basically lists, I thought it was a nice sort of list of all of the things that have been shown where the evidence supports a positive association between nature experience, however they defined it, and then increased psychological well-being. There's been positive affect, that is mood, increases in happiness, increase in a sense of meaning and purpose in life, positive effects on cognitive function, memory and attention, imagination and creativity, all kinds of things. And at the same time, they've also were able to, they also talked about evidence that supports an association between nature experience and a reduction in risk factors for some types of mental illness, presumably, most importantly, depression. And what they found is that association or engaging with nature tends to improve your sleep and also reduces stress. And both of these things are major risk factors for depression. Interestingly, this last study that I mentioned down here came out this summer, and it was saying that for every, I think it's hour and a half above the median that you spend per day in outdoor light, you have noticeable boosts in mood and sleep. So that outdoor light in particular was really important it was the focus of this study, and that alone also affects your sleep. So I guess I sort of wanted to make the point that we feel better in general when we engage with nature. And one of the things I've been really interested in is why. And so As far as I can tell, these hypotheses fall into maybe three different categories of explanations. Explanations or theories tend to be either evolutionarily based or cultural or biological. And so by evolutionary, what I mean is that in general, these theories assume that there is an innate, almost hardwired reason for why people feel better and have all these positive effects in response to nature. And one of the people to propose this initially was Erich Fromm, and then later this was developed by E.O. Wilson into this concept of biophilia. And biophilia is basically a proposition that we have an innate emotional attachment to nature, or as humans to other living things, and that this emotional attachment leads to reverence and awe, and that this in turn restores us. And so this is based, these evolutionary hypothesis is based on the assumption that because humans, for most of their evolutionary history, were evolved in natural settings, that we've been cognitively and emotionally shaped by evolving in these settings over time. And it's led to a need to continue to associate with these natural settings. This idea, I think it's a really interesting one, but obviously it's going to be really hard to test. And the other thing is there's some disagreement in the literature too on whether or not, this can somehow be genetically programmed, or whether or not there's some form of biological learning that's taking place. But again, I said it's really hard to test. And most of the time I see reference to the ideas of biophilia in studies that are just comparing, does nature have an effect? It's not looking, they're not studies trying to tease out why. Now, another sort of variation on this theory that I've seen is the prospect refuge theory, where people are drawn to nature, particular combinations of open areas that might offer the prospect, for example, the prospect of finding food, and then also closed areas. This kind of thing is really appealing because it provides refuge. But again, this comes from the idea that we have this innate tendency towards these features that have, because of our evolutionary association with nature. Now, another sort of idea that is, I think, falls into this evolutionary category is that of attention restoration theory. And attention restoration theory, basically, this was an idea that was proposed by Stephen and Rachel Kaplan quite a while ago, the 1980s, I think. And their idea was that when we are focused, concentrating, or directing our attention on something, for example, schoolwork or studying or work or whatever, something that requires directed attention, that eventually that we get mentally fatigued, and that nature presents this opportunity. It restores us. And so basically the way that they sort of looked at that is that the way that, so that this attention restoration theory has basically four components that they talked about. One of them is that if you leave what you're doing to go to a natural area, then obviously you're getting away from the things that were directing your attention. And then the idea was that nature presents just the right level of soft fascination. That is, allows you to have, sort of focus on things that hold your attention, but effortlessly. So there's no, you don't have to concentrate to pay attention. It just sort of happens. And that also being in nature, they thought allowed people to recognize that they are connected to something beyond themselves, something that is sort of a part of a larger world. And then finally, they recognized that this whole experience had to be sort of compatible with your sense of goals, that for, you couldn't counter the other kinds of things in life that you were sort of trying to achieve. And this theory, attention restoration theory, has received a lot of attention because people can actually sort of measure the restoration of attention using either experimental studies where people go into the field, or even just looking at natural images. The metrics tend to focus on things like cognition, the cognitive aspects, right? So cognition itself, and memory and creativity. When people look at these studies, when people actually sort of look at this effect, and then on top of that, well, okay. But I guess what I wanted to say is that then more recently, so probably more studies have been done on attention restoration theory than just about any other part or any other of the ideas that I've seen for why people connect to nature. But recently, enough of them have been done that recently there's been quite a few or several criticisms raised. And one of them is, basically when people are doing meta-analyses of a lot of this literature, they're not finding effects that are as strong as they could be. And some people have raised the point, well, this is evolutionary because part of it assumes that, or it's an evolutionary idea based in evolution, because part of it assumes that our attention gets fatigued. Like some people might argue that we're just not motivated enough to continue to pay attention. Well, personally, I know my brain gets really tired, so I'm not having trouble with that assumption, but psychologists have. Okay, and so in the 1980s, Roger Ulrich proposed that maybe it wasn't just that nature restores our attention directly because it provides soft fascination, but maybe nature reduces stress, and that allows us to sort of restore our attention. And so again, it's evolutionary because the stress reduction theory posits that there was an automatic positive response to non-threatening natural environments with survival promoting qualities that has arisen from our evolutionary history with nature. And that then this positive response allows people to return to a more relaxed state. This again is also something that is relatively easily measured with things like salivary cortisol levels and blood pressure and other sort of biological markers. And there has been evidence suggesting that people definitely feel a lot less stressed after they've been in nature. One of the other sort of ideas is something called the perpetual fluency account. And this basically talks about the fact that there's a positive affect, that is positive mood responses to nature occur because nature allows us to really effortlessly process the information. And so one example that's been studied in this regard is that of fractals, which are these sort of similar repeating patterns at different scales. For example, through the increasing or decreasing size in the branches of a tree. This is a very fractal view, and that because of these higher levels of fractal redundancy or visual redundancy. It makes the patterns really easy to process. And then this effortless processing increases attention, allows increased attention, and restores or basically reduces stress. So again, it's a slight variation on the view of attention reduction theory. But it's also based on, in part, on the idea that human visual systems are particularly sensitive to fractal patterns. So again, the effortlessness part is key here. And then these evolutionary patterns have been described as sort of bottom-up approaches where you would where humans are born in essentially with this tendency to engage with nature and have it result in positive effects. The alternative is what has been described more as a top-down approach, which is really a cultural approach. And this is not received nearly as much attention, but is becoming, I think, a little bit more popular in terms of an idea to test. And there is one theory that has been proposed, which is that humans respond to nature because we have had previous experiences in our lives which were created positive emotion. And then when we experience nature a second time or re-engage with nature, that emotion resurfaces. And so the ideas that have been proposed, for example, are that if you have positive emotions, you find nature beautiful, you have a positive emotion in response to the beauty, then the next time that you see something beautiful that's natural, it's natural, it's beautiful, and your positive emotions are evoked. Or, the idea that, for example, your parents tell you to go outside because it's good for you, and you somehow internalize that. Or you go on vacation in natural environments, and people are generally a lot more relaxed and happy on vacation, and so when they see natural environments, it brings up those emotions. But like I said, there have been very few studies that have attempted to look at cultural reasons for why we might be responding to nature the way we do. And then there's the category that I find myself drawn to, which are what I think of as sort of the biological explanations. And one of them that has received quite a bit of attention is the idea of that volatile organic compounds that are produced by plants actually interact with receptors in our nasal passages that affect our nervous system. And so, for example, not for example, but plants make thousands of volatile organic, at least 1,000 or more of volatile organic compounds. And these compounds are generally, they're what's called isoprenoids, and they include various terpenes, and they're compounds like limonene or pinene. And they're one of the reasons that when you walk through a pine forest, for example, it smells a lot different than walking through an oak forest or an open field. All these volatiles that are being released, and they interact with our nasal passages. And what they do when they interact with our nasal passages is suppress our sympathetic nervous system, and that is the fight or flight response, and they tend to increase or promote parasympathetic nerve activity, which is sort of rest and digest response, and therefore our blood pressure improves. And among other things, people have shown responses in the amount of natural killer cells in our body, which are sort of our immune response to certain provocations. And so, it turns out that just breathing natural products can actually increase our sense of well-being in nature. Okay, and I just wanted to say these were at one point, and you will sometimes see the term phytoncides, which is just meaning something that plants produce to basically deter herbivores, is where that comes from. But it's the whole sort of broader collection of organic compounds, I think, that people are starting to try to get a handle on now, not just, and that's what most of probably anti-herbivory effects are probably what most volatile compounds are doing anyway in some level. Okay, so let's see if I can go on to this. And the people who proposed, who first proposed this idea of what they called the phytoncides, it came mostly out of a lab initially from Japan, and these are some of the same groups of researchers who have also been promoting forest therapy and forest bathing, or what is Shinrin-yoku. And basically, the idea behind this is that you walk calmly and quietly and very mindfully in nature for some period of time. And yeah, so there's a connection there between those, or the ideas of forest bathing, and the researchers who have studied these volatile organic compounds, which I think is interesting. And then finally, in the biological realm, there is an increasing body of literature showing that some of the positive effects that we see, in particular, these increase in killer cells in our body, may be related to, in the one case, soil bacteria, which is this mycobacterium. It's a common soil bacterium, and it turns out that killer cells in our bodies go up when we handle it. So, and this has been shown in several different studies. And so just gardening, for example, is going to boost your immune system. And then other people have proposed that basically what's being shown is that people who spend a lot of time in nature have higher diversity of the microbiome in their gut flora. And so this leads to lots of different positive health outcomes as well. And so this is yet another reason, that a biological reason, I think, that spending time outside makes us healthier and in exchange happier. So, when you put it all together, it's almost like there's as many different ideas or theories about why spending time in nature is beneficial for humans, as there are human responses to spending time in nature. And my guess is that we're never going to find that it's one thing that is really a key explanation. It's a whole bunch of these little things, or not little, but it's a whole bunch of different things. But the one thing that I think is emerging over the last 10 years is it's very clear that our brains and our immune systems are responding to being in nature. And so, it doesn't even take very long. I mean, there was a recent meta-analysis of a lot of studies looking at the dosage effect, and it turns out that as little as 10 minutes in nature can lower your blood pressure and decrease the amount of cortisol in your saliva. And other studies now are suggesting that the longer that you spend in nature and the deeper the immersion, the longer lasting the effects. But we still need a lot more work on long-term dosage effects. But all of this brings me back to NatureRx. So NatureRx at Cornell was started by Don Rakow and his colleagues, who were aware of literature that was coming out suggesting that spending time in nature was beneficial for mental health in particular. And they combined their resources in working with the mental health providers at Cornell to write prescriptions, actually developed a very active program promoting nature health, promoting Nature RX. And since this time, or the concepts that nature is good for you, and the RX part comes from the prescriptions, but that's not, I don't think essential, prescriptions have to be an essential piece of this anymore. And so when I heard about this project, I thought that we should do something like this at UConn. Because after teaching for so many years about how nature works and using my own research to try to understand how nature works, it was really eye-opening to me to realize that what we were teaching might also be affecting our students in sort of academic ways, right? That there were ways that it may not just be what we were teaching, but that through developing a connection with nature, we were educating them, but we also may be helping them maybe a little bit in other ways. And so one of the things that we at least wanted to do, and because we started during the pandemic and we couldn't have a lot of meetings, one of the things we wanted to do was compile maps, for example, of all of the trails in the town of Mansfield. So we got the trail layers from the town and from Joshua's Trust, and also from Yukon Forest, and we've put them all together on our webpage, and you can click on any one of them and get sort of some basic information about them. You can certainly see how long they are, because one of the things we thought was important is that, there are many points where, like, the town trail leads directly into a Joshua's Trust trail, and we wanted people to realize that they could actually keep walking. The other thing is that we also discovered there's 122 something miles, 0.3 or something miles of trails just within the Mansfield town borders. I mean, I find that astonishing, and it reminds me of how incredibly lucky we are, for those of us who love nature, to be in this area. So I would encourage you to take a look at this website. If you're interested, I'd be happy to answer any other questions. And before I go, I just wanted to say that one of the other things is that one of the things I've realized is that developing this connection, really, which is what it is, between humans and nature, and reestablishing this connection for people who have had more urban upbringing, is it's not only good for us as people, it's really good for nature, from the perspective that we're learning now that when people feel connected to nature, they're more likely to be engaged with conservation and preservation. And in fact, there's an entire field of psychology recognized now by the American Psychological Association called conservation psychology, which is just exactly what it says up here, the scientific studies of the reciprocal relationships between humans and the rest of nature. And with the goal of encouraging conservation of the natural world. And so, as much as I love telling people how plants work, I think it's just as important to go outside and not say a word sometimes. Okay, I'll stop there. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any, but first I have one last slide, which is my Yukon acknowledgements. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cindy. I learned a lot personally, and I actually look forward to kind of diving more into what you've mentioned, particularly by visiting your website and things like that. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time not screen sharing here.
I think I can make you stop myself.
Okay, thank you, because my mouse is disappearing as soon as it goes under stop sharing. There we go.
There we go. So if anyone has any questions, you can feel free to type it in the chat and I can, read it out loud, or you are welcome to unmute yourself, turn on your video, and ask any questions. We've got a few minutes, so feel free.
Did I talk too long?
No, not at all.
When do you usually end? Is it at 8:30?
Yep. We usually try and stick to an hour, so you're right in there.
Great.
So people are thanking you and enjoyed the
presentation. That's good. That's nice. So. Yeah, I actually might be able to turn on my chat now. No. Here. Yeah, I can't see it. So
that's okay.
Yeah.
Anybody have any questions? Ooh, Lauren has a question. She's curious about the health biomarkers. You noted cross-sectional, but have there been any studies that have measured the biomarkers continuously?
Those would fall under I think the category of the more longitudinal studies where individuals are followed for much longer periods of time. And I have not focused so much on the physiological literature.
She was particularly inquiring about ambulatory blood pressure or cortisol levels.
Yes, so I can't name a specific study, but I know there have been a lot of studies out there that have looked at these features. I can certainly direct you to some meta-analyses that cite studies that have looked at those features.
Actually, Cindy, if there are any resources that people might find helpful having listened to this and want to dive deeper, you could send those to me so we can kind of pass that along to people. That would be super helpful.
Sure, I'll put together a list of references.
That would be great. Because I'm sure there are many of us here that are going to want to dive deeper and learn more. Well, thank you, Lauren, for your question. Any other thoughts, questions? Going once, going twice. I won't make everyone sit awkwardly in silence. Lauren has another. Go, Lauren. No, please don't apologize. Oh, and Carolyn Hubert is clapping her hands. Wait for, we'll let Lauren have a second to type out her question. While she does that, for those of you who are here, thank you very much for coming. And I hope that you all have signed up for our e-news with Joshua's Trust or follow us on Facebook. But if you haven't, please do so. We have more webinars like this one. We have other events, hikes, opportunities to get out in nature. So we would love to have you as part of our Joshua's Trust community. All right. So Lauren's question is, do you think that the effects of nature are highly intertwined with the effects of movement in nature? And has anyone tried to separate the effects of, for example, walking in nature versus just sitting?
I don't know if there have been specific studies. Actually, I can't say of walking versus sitting. I know that movement is not required just from the image studies and the fact that, when people are in, for example, these various devices that do brain scans, and they see imagery of nature, that's all it takes. But I am sure that moving in nature, there's a lot of studies on the effects of green exercise, if you will, and or some studies, and there's a pretty positive effect there. So, but comparing directly sitting versus walking, I don't know.
And then Nancy was curious, is Nature RX just a university phenomena, or is it go beyond the university setting?
Well, there's Parks RX, which is different, but that was sort of the initial inspiration. As Nature RX, as far as I know, is mostly a university campus thing. I don't know, for example, if it's been involved, if there are any high schools or anything that are also sort of at any other educational levels than college campuses. And that's partly because that's was Don Rackow's orientation. And then, of course, and Nancy has seen these, there's, if you Google Nature RX, you might end up with some really funny spoofs on nature as prescribed. Well, I don't know if they're spoofs, they're tongue-in-cheek sort of approaches to prescribing nature, and they're hysterical. And they're only 3 minutes each. And so I would suggest you Google Nature RX. But
Sounds like we've got some homework.
on YouTube, yeah.
And Lauren says thank you for your answer. Anybody else? All right, well, I will wrap it up. And we will send a follow-up email with additional resources and maybe even Cindy's contact information. I don't know. We'll let her decide if she wants to share that or not. And that way you can continue learning more about this subject. And like I said, please follow us, Joshua's Trust, so that you can support the nature in your community. So thank you very much, Cindy. We've got claps. We've got claps coming up. So
thank you.
All right, everyone, have a lovely evening.
Yeah, lots of fun. Thanks.